Something Like Infinity. The Woodlands, 1997. Words are like names. They define us. Take, for instance, someone named Will. He might be called William at his workplace, hoping to sound more adult. He might be Billy to his family, since he'll always remain a little boy in their eyes. The guys down at the bar might call him Bill, and his lover might use a special pet name. Sometimes we choose our titles. Usually they are assigned to us. Either way, we often utilize a variety of names to distinguish the different roles we play. Words are much the same. Like names, they help define our concept of the world. This is best demonstrated with examples outside our language that offer more nuance than English. Does an emotional state exist between like and love? Spanish suggests so. Te quiero. Or how about a small shared meal between breakfast and lunch, or between lunch and dinner? Merendar is the word for that. Have you ever sought a term for the period of casual conversation that follows eating with family and friends? Sobremesa is the word you seek. The true lesson here is that rather than limiting us, language can help us better understand ourselves and our surroundings. All it takes is a previously undiscovered word to change our perspective, or a new name to give us a fresh start. Senor Langdon blinked, then looked up from his pad of notebook paper. The students in his class were still hunched over their desks as they struggled with the practice test. Aside from Daniel Wigmore, who prided himself on being the first to complete any assignment, and Julie Snyder, who had wanted to take French instead and expressed her disdain of Spanish by stubbornly ignoring assignments. No concern of his, because at the end of the day, Senor Langdon would resume the boring life of Ross Langdon. He returned his attention to the lesson he was preparing, hoping to instill in his students that learning a language was more than memorizing a new vocabulary with a different grammatical system. Once the Spanish language had sunk into their thick skulls, they would never again see things in quite the same way. He decided to ditch the line about pet names. Any mention of a lover might be considered inappropriate. Plus, it was a painful reminder that he didn't have one of his own. Ross worked on revising his lesson until the bell rang. The students groaned. He felt like joining them. Only his 2-star pupils had completed the assignment. With less than a month left in the school year, they really should have this material down already. Just leave your tests where they are, Ross said. I'll take a look, and we can go over them tomorrow. The only responses he received were rolled eyes or apathetic shrugs. Except for Daniel Wigmore, whose freckled face smiled proudly. Ross would check his paper first, just in case speed had tripped him up. Daniel normally pulled in A's regardless of haste. The kid had an annoying personality, but he would probably be the next Bill Gates. Ross watched the classroom empty faster than it ever filled. Stomach grumbling with hunger, he walked down the rows of desks, collecting each test until he had a neat stack. He decided to look them over while treating himself to one of the cafeteria's burgers. When doused with enough ketchup, they tasted bearable. The burgers, not the tests. But he was nearly hungry enough to try the latter. Ross was heading for the door, attention on Daniel's paper, when he saw in his peripheral vision that the doorway was closed. Odd. He reached up while still searching for errors, intending to push the door open, but instead of chilly metal, his palm pressed against warm cotton. Ross glanced up in confusion, finding a man rather than a door, although the toned chest was nearly as firm. Then he noticed the police uniform and jerked away. His glasses slipped, cheeks already burning as he pushed them back up his nose. The police officer had barely moved. His dark eyes scanned Ross critically before one of the finely arched eyebrows rose. "Mr. Langdon?" the officer inquired. "Senor Langdon," he repeated out of habit, which was silly because his entire family was hopelessly white and from nowhere more exotic than Oklahoma. He only called himself Senor for this class. Senior Langdon, the officer amended, his pronunciation off. I'd like to ask you a few questions. Ross searched his memory for any criminal acts he might have committed, no matter how trivial. Parking tickets, littering, sampling a cherry tomato from the grocery store before buying them just to be sure they were sweet enough. He hadn't done any of those things lately, but it didn't take long to leap to another possibility. One of the students, or someone's parents, had discovered the truth. His big, dark secret. He was certain it would end his teaching career. I was just about to have lunch, he replied, hoping to avoid the inevitable. Maybe later? The officer didn't move, which was unfortunate because he was still blocking the only path to freedom. This won't take long. Ross nodded, accepting his fate. Okay. He gestured to his desk, realizing too late that the officer would have nowhere to sit. He moved behind it anyway to feel more secure and remained standing. The officer stood on the opposite side as they sized each other up. His dark hair was bleached on top, platinum blonde except where the roots had grown out, a stark contrast to the dark eyes. He could be of Hispanic heritage. Perhaps that might help establish camaraderie. But would that translate to leniency? Ross glanced down at the badge, seeking a last name. This didn't go unnoticed. My name is Officer Adler. Adler, Ross repeated, even though it didn't tell him much. The name sounded German. Didn't it mean eagle? Or perhaps hawk, which would be appropriate considering the sensation of being watched by one. What can I do for you, sir? I'm investigating a series of arsons. Fire starting? He was in the clear. Oh, thank God. Now the officer really appeared suspicious, probably because Ross had practically swiped the back of his arm across his sweaty forehead and said, Phew, that was a close one. Are you feeling all right? Adler inquired. Low blood sugar, that's all. You were saying? The fires began last year, toward the end of summer. We now believe a student at this school could be responsible. Ross shook his head. If so, none of them have confided in me. I would have reported it. The reason I'm here, Adler continued, is because I had an encounter with the perpetrator recently. He shouted at me as he fled the scene. In Spanish. Oh, so you saw what he looked like. You should have come sooner when the students were still here. The night in question was dark, Adler said. I was unable to determine much except his age, and... He closed his eyes briefly, as if getting sidetracked. That's beside the point. I'm here because I need your help. I wrote down what the suspect shouted, or at least I tried to. He unbuttoned the chest pocket of his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper which he handed over. Ross took it with interest. The handwriting was messy and angular, the Spanish just a phonic representation of what the officer had heard, but enough had been captured to interpret. All nervousness forgotten, he sat down, grabbed his red pen, and started making corrections. He became so absorbed in his work that he was unsure how much time passed. When he looked up again, Adler was still standing there, watching him, patiently. What does it say? Ross leaned back. Eres muy lento. Así nunca me vas a alcanzar Gorinflón. Translation? Ross cleared his throat. You're too slow, you'll never catch me. Is that all? Gorinflón. Fat ass. Adler glared. His words, not mine, Ross said hurriedly. From what I can see, you're all muscle. The officer's expression became difficult to read. He didn't seem offended, but still it probably wasn't a good idea to praise the body of any visiting law enforcement agent, no matter how tight it might appear. Blood sugar, Ross repeated. I get lightheaded when hungry, sorry. Adler leaned over the desk, tapping the translated paper. This sounds advanced. It's not exactly complicated, but it is flawless. Then again, I could be inadvertently fixing mistakes that were spoken instead of correcting what you managed to write down. Uh-huh. How many of your students are capable of saying something like that, even incorrectly? The guys in particular. Ross shrugged. A few. I don't know. They're not really my students. Meaning? Didn't the office tell you? I'm just a substitute for Senora Vega. She's been having health problems all year, so I've been here for most of her absence. Long enough to narrow down the list? Maybe, Ross said. Now that the focus wasn't on him, he didn't feel so intimidated. Despite his claim that he would have reported any student who spoke to him about illegal activity, he wasn't likely to. Not automatically or without knowing the circumstances. He didn't want to see any of these kids get into trouble. After all, he'd been in high school himself only 6 short years ago. Ross remembered how difficult the world could be at that age, and how dealing with bullying, divorcing parents, academic pressure, or just angst over the future in general had driven him and his friends to do all sorts of irresponsible things. But they hadn't burnt down any buildings. These fires, how bad are they? Adler pushed away from the desk to stand upright again. They're getting worse. It began with small fires in open fields and empty lots. Lately, the arsonist has focused on park benches and playground equipment. Mailboxes, too, the large public ones on street corners. But no private property, Ross said dismissively. Adler noticed this indifference. Actually, private property has been involved, too, and I'll remind you that destroying mail is a federal offense. Of course, right. Have you considered that the accused might not be one of my students? This is Texas, after all. The arsonist could be a native Spanish speaker. Adler placed his hands on his belt. I have reason to believe otherwise. Now, if you could please draw up a list of names, I'll take it from there. Sure, it's just... they're all so young. Officer Adler exhaled, his face handsome even when tense with impatience. I understand that it's your job to care for these kids and keep them safe. We share that duty and conviction. If one of these fires gets out of control, people could be hurt, including your students or even the arsonist himself. And you're right, these kids are still young. The judge will take that into consideration. Ross stared into dark, unwavering eyes, finding only sincerity there. Okay. What else can you tell me about the suspect? Adler considered him a moment, then spun around and marched to the classroom door to close it, shutting out the ambient hallway noise. When he returned to the desk, he rested one set of knuckles on the surface. What I am about to say doesn't leave this room. Understand? Ross nodded. The suspect was caught in a compromising situation. Ross tried to decipher this. He was taking a dump? Officer Adler's jaw clenched, either out of annoyance or an attempt to hold back laughter. He wasn't alone, so there might be 2 perpetrators involved. Both are male and were in a partial state of undress. One of them was on his knees. This time, Ross made damn sure to maintain his poker face, because the conversation had ventured into dangerous territory again. I see. Good. The officer's nod was curt. Does this narrow the field? Ross felt his temper rising. You're asking me to out my students? I wouldn't even if I could. But no, it doesn't narrow the field, because none of them have confided in me about such things. Considering the social backlash that comes with being openly gay, I can't say I blame them. And frankly, now that I know what you're really after, I no longer feel like helping you with your investigation. Adler's nostrils flared, but his tone was even when he spoke. I'm just as interested in preserving their anonymity as you are. In fact. He clenched his jaw and shook his head again. Never mind. All I want to do is prevent more fires. The rest can remain off record. Simple as that, Ross challenged. It won't be in your report. Adler glowered. I wasn't the only one there. My partner feels it might be important. I'm hoping to prove otherwise. For now, I've convinced her to keep it under wraps. Wow, really? Really. Ross stared, trying to see past the handsome face to the substance beyond. He didn't know this man, but Adler seemed noble enough. Or maybe that's what Ross wanted to believe. Regardless, such issues were sensitive, potentially life-changing and even life-threatening, so he held his tongue. Help me, Adler pleaded. If we stop the arsonist now, the rest can be ignored. Was that coercion? Name a suspect or we'll make this about sexual orientation instead? Then again, if he refused to comply, other teachers would be interviewed, and they might not be as discreet with their knowledge. Fine. You'll help me. I'll need a little time, but yes. Thank you. Adler visibly relaxed. Think it over. I realize none of your students would be out to you, but you might be able to eliminate anyone with a girlfriend. That, combined with the necessary skill in Spanish. Ross nodded again. I'll see what I can do. Good. Officer Adler pulled out a business card and was about to hand it over. Then he thought twice, flipped it over, and grabbed Ross's red pen to scribble on the back. This is my home number. I can't stress how important this case is to me, so please, don't hesitate to call as soon as you have a list. Will do. Thanks. They stood facing each other. Then Officer Adler nodded cordially, pivoted, and marched toward the door. Ross watched him go. His feelings for the man were conflicted, but one thing was certain. Adler wasn't a Gordon Flon, because that ass was firm and fine. Ross decided to eat his lunch in the teacher's lounge, needing time alone to organize his thoughts. He didn't want to start viewing each student with unfair suspicion. The break room was mostly empty, just 3 other souls present, but 2 of them were venomous. Coach Reynolds had thinning red hair and a pug nose. His face often flushed when he complained about foreigners, liberals, or any other demographic he found offensive. Then there was Mrs. Jones, the journalism teacher. She was a waspish woman who chose her words more carefully, all of them cutting. Ross wavered in the doorway, experiencing a flashback to the 8th grade when his family first moved to Texas and lunch became a daily struggle to find an empty seat near a friendly face. Then he saw Ms. Hughes, the science teacher with a heavy build and acne scars across her cheeks. She was good company, so he sat down across from her. Mrs. Jones raised her eyebrows at this, probably because she often talked bad about Ms. Hughes behind her back. Or maybe she disapproved of him, a lowly substitute using the teacher's lounge. Ross ignored her and pulled out the sandwich he had packed in the morning, the one that made a cafeteria burger look scrumptious by comparison. He might have a gift for foreign languages, but he was no chef. Care for some chips? Ms. Hughes said, offering the bag she was snacking from. Thank you, no, Ross replied, wishing the others would stop staring at him. Coach Reynolds was the first to look away. As I was saying, he grumbled, there should be a screening process. Proof of nationality. Most of these schools cram as many Mexicans on their soccer teams as possible just because they're good at the game. But if they weren't born in this country... Mrs. Jones held up her hand, cutting off his rant, attention still on Ross. Was that a police officer I saw entering your classroom? Jesus, did she have spies everywhere? Few things seemed to escape her notice. He nodded, taking a handful of chips after all, and intending to stuff them into his mouth so he couldn't speak. What did he want? Mrs. Jones pressed. He just needed something translated, Ross said, a cluster of Doritos about to plug his maw. Anything of interest? He sighed and set the chips on the same flattened paper bag where his sandwich rested. Not really. A suspect yelled a few words at him that the officer didn't understand. Lucky you, Ms. Hughes said cheerfully. Sounds like something out of a TV show. The police needing to consult with us. I've always wanted that to happen. Surely it's just a matter of time before a global emergency strikes that only a science teacher can solve. Ross chuckled in appreciation. Don't give up hope yet. What would you do if they asked you about the melting ice caps? Dry ice, Ms. Hughes responded. Lots of it, dropped by helicopters at both global poles. I don't think it would help, but all that fog sure would look cool. Ross grinned. Throw in some lasers and Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon and you've got yourself a party. Mrs. Jones wasn't amused by this exchange. You would think the police department would have their own resources, she said, rather than needing to consult with a substitute. Ross shrugged. I'm cheap labor. And an amateur detective, because he had his own case to solve. An idea occurred to him. Maybe the journalism teacher's nosiness could be used to his advantage. He didn't know of any gay students, but if rumors were floating around, she would have heard them. He couldn't reveal what Officer Adler had divulged, but if he was clever... Actually, I've been meaning to discuss something with you. A friend of mine sent me a newspaper from a different school. They have a large number of Mexican students, much like we do, and so they run additional articles in Spanish. Not only does that give them a sense of community, but it's good practice for the students learning the language. Mrs. Jones crossed her arms over her chest. How am I supposed to edit a newspaper I can't even read? Well, you can always learn or ask for my... Where exactly is this school located? New Mexico, Ross answered. Knowing the paper and not the idea would become the topic. Santa Fe, to be precise. Sounds awfully liberal to me, Coach Reynolds interjected. Ross nodded. I suppose so. They certainly have more resources for students than we do, such as a gay-straight alliance that... Coach Reynolds' face turned a darker shade of pink. A what? It's for... I know what it's for, Coach Reynolds snarled. Then there was no need to interrupt him, Miss Hughes pointed out. I, for one, think it's a wonderful idea. Mrs. Jones sneered. You would. We have no need for such things in this school. There aren't any gay students enrolled here? Ross asked innocently. That's beside the point, Mrs. Jones said. She exchanged a look with Coach Reynolds. The older man smirked. Bentley. Who? Ross asked with a dry mouth. Ben Bentley, Mrs. Jones said, not bothering to address him directly. I showed you the poem, didn't I? Yes. Coach Reynolds laughed without warmth. I could have told you sooner from the limp-wristed way he throws a ball. Ms. Hughes slammed her palm against the table. This conversation strikes me as highly inappropriate and tasteless. Mrs. Jones refused to be chastised. It's hardly a secret. Right, Coach Reynolds said. The kid, what's it called? Fell out? Everyone knows. Came out, Ms. Hughes corrected. That must have taken tremendous courage. It certainly didn't take smarts, the coach cackled. He should have asked the Wizard of Oz for brains instead. He deserves our respect, Ms. Hughes insisted, but no one backed her up, not even Ross, because he was too worried to take sides on this matter, lest he draw attention to himself. So, Mrs. Jones said. She nodded in his direction, making him think he was busted. You feel the school paper should be written in Spanish, and that we need a gay support group for one solitary student. I think, Ross said, standing and abandoning his lunch, that this conversation has ventured into a direction I never intended. Funny how that always seems to happen among certain company. Ms. Hughes said. Ross couldn't bring himself to respond. He felt too guilty for not supporting her position, and too disgusted by the bigoted attitudes of the other teachers, so he turned and left the room. He was angry at himself, but what could he do? He loved teaching, loved it, and saying too much could cost him his job. Maybe he was being foolish. This was just a substitute position. Losing it wouldn't change much. But if he stayed quiet and finished the assignment without controversy, he could take the good reference and move to a different city, somewhere far away from the woodlands. Santa Fe held appeal because the paper he had mentioned was real. Not all schools were as backward as this one. Ross was putting as much distance as possible between himself and the teacher's lounge when he heard someone call his name. Ms. Hughes. She was struggling to keep up, her expression concerned. "A moment," she puffed. "Please." "Sure," Ross said, feeling it was the least he could do. An apology was on his lips, but she spoke first. "Is he in trouble?" "Sorry?" "Ben Bentley. With the visit from the police, I thought maybe." Whatever her fears were, they remained unspoken. "I don't know," Ross admitted. He hadn't had time to consider the implications. Ben was gay, the right age, and a student in his Spanish class. That certainly raised suspicion, although Ben's language skills weren't that great, from what he could remember. "What can you tell me about him?" "Don't bother checking with the office," she replied. "You won't find anything." "But you know something." "Only that he has a good heart. And yes, it has led him into trouble before, but nothing too serious. I'm not like some of the other teachers here. I don't judge and I don't gossip, but I am invested in the lives of my students." "What exactly was the officer asking about?" "Arson." Ms. Hughes shook her head instantly. "No, it isn't Ben." "You're probably right. Don't worry about it, please." "If only that were a choice." Ross offered his hand before they parted. The decision was spontaneous, and in retrospect, a little odd, but he didn't often meet another teacher who cared so much. More than that, she seemed like a decent human being. She shook his hand, clearly still concerned, but he couldn't offer any further comfort. Then he continued down the hall, eyes on the scuffed floor, as he silently cursed Officer Adler for dragging him into this mess. Senor Langdon was on edge, overseeing the same practice quiz he had given before lunch and the 2 periods that had followed. He didn't divide his attention between the class and a future lesson. Instead, he focused on each student, and as much as he hated it, made each a suspect in his mind. Ronnie Adams had a decent understanding of the Spanish language, taking the new words he learned and twisting them to make jokes. The guy sitting in one chair over, Craig Thompson, was his guaranteed laugh track. They were friends, that much was clear, but were they more? He started to picture them in a compromising situation before he felt uncomfortable and banished the image from his mind. Besides, he was fairly certain that Ronnie had a girlfriend, since he had made her the topic of a presentation once. He crossed them both off his mental list and continued to scan the room. At least he didn't need to consider the girls. His eyes settled briefly on Mike Simmons, who was seriously overweight and unlikely to outrun anyone. He looked at and dismissed George Rohrer, who could write Spanish, but was too bashful to speak it. Then there was Tim Wyman, who wasn't struggling with the quiz so much as working methodically. Deliberately slow, like someone who knew all the answers but didn't want to let on. His grades in this class were nearly perfect, if Ross recalled correctly, and Tim was certainly athletic enough to outrun someone like Adler, despite the officer's toned muscles, broad chest, and narrow hips. Ross started to imagine a different sort of compromising situation, one that involved handcuffs in the teacher's lounge. He snapped out of it when he saw Tim glance at the clock. Class was almost over, and Tim must have realized this because he breezed through the rest of the test. He moved from question to question, answering each like it was basic arithmetic. No doubt about it, he had been holding back. Ross casually flipped open the grade book and noticed the consistently high scores next to Tim's name. Funny, since he rarely raised his hand to volunteer an answer or ask a question. As understanding as Ross tried to be, he couldn't let such things slide. The bell rang. He stood along with his students. "Leave the tests where they are," he shouted over the rising noise. The last period of the day was always followed by a desperate exodus. "Mr. Wyman, if I could speak with you, please." Ross didn't know what he would say, or do. Should he frisk the guy for lighters and matches? What if he found them? Citizen's arrest? "How's it going, Senor Langdon?" Tim was standing before his desk, his silver eyes a striking contrast to the deeply tanned skin. One of his parents could be a native speaker, and if so, Tim might have been raised bilingual. Ross decided to slip into Spanish to test him. "You've been doing well. I'm impressed by your grades." Tim's brow crinkled. He made a face like someone concentrating. "Muchas gracias." So much thought needed for a phrase that everyone in this country knew? One thing was for sure, Tim's Spanish was better than his acting. "I feel you could be in a more advanced class." "Really? No. This one is challenging enough." "This charade is ludicrous." Ross watched his face closely for a reaction, knowing the words were too advanced for any of his students. Sure enough, Tim's cheeks grew a little red and his jaw clenched. "Sorry," Tim said, reverting to English. "You lost me there." "Then I'll discuss the matter with your parents instead." "Please don't." Tim's shoulders slumped. "Damn it." Ross shook his head disapprovingly. "You're already fluent." "My Spanish isn't perfect." Now those striking eyes were pleading with him. Tim was a handsome guy. He probably knew that and used it to his advantage, but Ross wasn't persuaded by such things. "Your Spanish is good enough that you don't need my help. Do you know how that makes me feel? Normally, when one of my students does well, like yourself, I'm proud. Teaching is my passion and what I've dedicated my life to. So when I find out someone in my class already knows what I have to offer, I feel foolish instead." "I have learned from you," Tim said. "I swear. My mom is Mexican, but we speak English at home, so I don't get much practice. That's what I'm here for. It's been helpful." "You're here for an easy A." "It's been helpful," Tim repeated. His jaw clenched again. "And yeah, I'm under a lot of pressure from my parents. I can barely keep up with my other classes, so having one that's a little easier." Ross hadn't been a teacher for long, but he had already seen how some parents pushed their children. Often these students were like Tim, who appeared perfect from the outside and were expected to be that way on the inside as well. "You need to pull your weight," Ross said. "There isn't much left to the school year, but you can still help other students. I have a few in my class who won't pass without tutoring." Tim groaned. "Seriously?" "It's either that or I really can contact your parents." Tim raised his hands, palms outward. Okay. No problem. Just tell me who." Ross said the first name that came to mind, the one that kept popping up in his thoughts ever since lunch break. Ben Bentley. Tim grew still, his expression disturbingly neutral. He was still handsome, but more like a store mannequin now. Cold, as was his response. "No." "No?" Ross repeated incredulously. Tim gave a barely perceptible shake of the head. "Sorry, but no." Ross struggled to understand why Tim's tone had grown so hard. Was it Ben's sexuality, or had he stumbled upon the truth? Officer Adler had found 2 young men in a compromising situation, and at least one of them had been fast and fluent enough to race away while shouting insults in Spanish. With a chill, he realized he had found the culprit. Tim Wyman was the arsonist. But how to proceed? "Okay," he said quickly. "Someone else then, Julie Snyder. She doesn't think Spanish is romantic like French is. Maybe you can convince her otherwise." Tim returned to life and flashed a disarming smile. "Of course," he said in upbeat tones. "Just tell me when and where, and I'll do my best. Thanks for being so understanding, Senor Langdon." "I'm pleased we reached an agreement." He gestured to the door, eager for Tim to leave. "I'll let you know the details tomorrow." "Okay." Tim kept smiling. "Thanks again." "No problem." Ross remained rigid until Tim disappeared into the hall. Then he scrambled for his wallet and pulled out a business card with red inked numbers on the back. Time to call in the cavalry. Ross lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment. Having a roommate would be nice. Not only would sharing the apartment have split the cost of rent and utilities in half, he also would have had someone to talk to or watch TV with. His best friend had moved away after graduating from college. His other friends already had living arrangements, and advertising for a roommate, a stranger, would make his secret harder to maintain. Ross was out to family and friends, but they knew to be discreet because of his occupation. Not that he was completely alone. He had pets. His landlord didn't allow much when it came to animals. Nothing with fur, just feathers or fins. Ross had opted for fish. He stood in front of their tank. Marie and Pierre were black skirt tetras, and feeding them always took top priority. When in a silly mood, Ross would give a Mr. Rogers-inspired speech while doing so. "Welcome, neighbor. So nice to have you. Doesn't it feel nice to do good things for others?" Tonight he skipped the speech and hurried to feed his fish so he could stand in his narrow kitchen next to the phone. Then he took out Officer Adler's card again to stare at the phone number on the flip side. All he needed to do was call. He had the perfect excuse. Something held him back regardless. He laughed when he realized what. His appearance. As ridiculous as it sounded, he wanted to make sure his hair looked okay. Ross set down the card and went into the bathroom. First he polished his black-framed glasses. Once they were back on his nose, he made sure his thick chestnut-brown hair was swept back, just how he liked it. Ross patted his stomach, pleased that he had given up eating instant pasta a few months back. No need to diet at the moment. After brushing his teeth, he smiled at himself, pretending he was facing a hunky police officer instead. Before his nerves could get the best of him again, he hurried back to the kitchen. He punched each numbered key carefully. Then he held the phone to his ear and the breath in his lungs. "Richard," a voice grunted. "Huh?" Ross replied. "Sorry, I must have the wrong—" He remembered the full name on the other side of the card. "Officer Adler?" "Speaking," the voice replied. "Hi, this is Senor Langdon, from school. The high one. School, that is. High school. Going great so far." The voice on the other end sounded receptive enough. "I didn't expect you to call so soon. Do you have the list ready?" "Not exactly. I might have something better." "You know who the arsonist is?" Ross hesitated, twirling a finger around the phone's cord. "I had an interesting conversation, let's put it that way." The unmistakable sound of a pen clicking preceded the response. "Go ahead. What's his name?" "It's just a theory," Ross said. "I'm not sure I'm comfortable naming anyone." "The details of the conversation, then," Adler replied, sounding less patient. "What will you do, arrest him?" "Arrest who? You haven't told me anything." "I'm just trying to understand how the process works." He heard a sigh but pressed on. "Listen, can we meet somewhere? I'd feel better if we did this face-to-face." "Uh-huh," Adler replied. "I can come over there, or we can meet at McDonald's, up to you." I'm not a big fan of the Golden Arches. I only suggested it as a public place. We can do Jack in the Box, Whataburger, or whatever you like. Chinese? Ross suggested. The line was quiet a moment. You want to eat together? I thought you only wanted to meet. Might as well do so over dinner. Or do you have plans? No, Adler said, still sounding uncertain. The pen could be heard clicking over and over again. All right, name the spot. Ross did so, heart pounding as he gave directions. I think I know the area. Good, Ross said. See you in about an hour? Sure, see you then. The line went dead. Was it sad to be excited about a dinner that clearly wasn't a date? In the end, Ross decided he didn't care. He couldn't remember the last time a handsome man had sat across from him during a meal. At this point, he'd take whatever he could get. Ross arrived at the Chinese restaurant wearing a comfortable t-shirt and a worn pair of jeans. The place offered an affordable buffet and attracted mostly college students, so no need to dress up. Besides, he didn't want to appear as desperate as he felt. He regretted this decision when Officer Adler showed up wearing a dress shirt, tight jeans, and freshly styled hair. Or maybe he always looked that way when off duty. Some guys were more attractive when in uniform, but Richard did just fine without it, too. Ross stood up from the table and offered his hand. Thank you for meeting me like this, Officer Adler. Richard, Adler responded, shaking his hand. I'm off duty, and it's going to seem weird if people overhear you say officer to someone in plain clothes. They'll think I'm undercover. Ross imagined him under his covers and tittered nervously. That makes sense. I already told the waitress we both want the buffet. Is that okay? Richard shrugged. Sure. They walked to the buffet together and stood side by side as they loaded up their plates. Ross snuck a few glances at him. Officer Adler was gone. For now, at least. Just like the lesson he had been working on earlier, a new name revealed a new aspect to a person, and this one felt more real. Never had he considered that police officers had private lives or engaged in the mundane activities that everyone else did. Paying bills, taking out the trash, and so on. Had they met this way instead, he would have assumed Richard was a young professional, someone in the finance industry or maybe a law firm intern. Richard's presence in this everyday environment made Ross feel even more frustrated that they could never be together. Gay people were less likely to join the police force, and even if by some miracle Richard was one of the few, well, he was probably already taken. As they sat at the table, Ross casually checked for a wedding ring. He didn't see one, but rather than torturing himself with fantasies, he focused on relaying what he had learned. So, it's got to be him, Ross said at the end of his story. I found the arsonist. Richard didn't seem to share this conviction. Maybe. Maybe? Are you kidding? This student can speak Spanish. He's athletic enough to outrun you. The perpetrator had a head start, Richard made sure to point out. Okay, but those things combined with Tom's uneasy relationship with Bob, a.k.a. Tim and Ben, Ross had changed the names to protect the innocent, even though he was sure they were actually guilty. I really believe this is the perpetrator in question, or however you guys say it. Richard fought down amusement. This other person, the one the arsonist might be involved with, you said his name was Bob Biggins? Mm-hmm. And the kid who called me a fat ass, he's Tom Wilcox. Ross squirmed. Yep. 2 fires were set that night, Richard said, spearing a batter-fried piece of chicken with his fork and dragging it through orange sauce. A real estate sign and a welcome mat, both at the home of another student. Okay, Ross shrugged. What's your point? That I don't understand why our 2 lovers set the fires and then reconvened at the playground so they could entertain each other. Maybe that's how they get their kicks. They obviously like doing it in public. Maybe they're thrill seekers. Richard tried holding back a smile and failed. He had the prettiest teeth. I think it's a good lead, he said, but I need more to go on. Parents tend to get defensive when you accuse their children of arson, not to mention the other situation. Ross scowled. You promised to leave that part out. I don't know if I can, Richard replied. As I said, my partner feels it's important, and this is exactly why I didn't trust you. I knew you wouldn't understand. You're going to ruin the lives of these. Hey, I'm trying to be careful, and you have no idea. Seriously, you're clueless. And you aren't? Ross raised his chin defiantly. No, I'm not. I know exactly what it's like to fear being who I really am, and even though I'm not ashamed, sometimes there's too much at stake. You're not listening. I do understand. I feel that way every single day. Ross stared. What? Richard glared at the empty table next to theirs. Nothing. It didn't sound like nothing to him. Hold on, are you saying that you're... Drop it, Richard said, tossing his napkin next to his plate. Thank you for your help. You can't leave yet. Ross stood, feeling panicked. Pressing the topic of sexuality would only scare Richard off, so he switched back to one that would interest him more. Tom and Bob aren't their real names. I figured. Richard pulled out his wallet. I'm sure I have enough to go on. Please, Ross tried. I'm sorry, I just get defensive because they're my students. Most of them yawn through my classes, and I get treated like a second-class citizen by other teachers, but I don't care. All I want is to broaden minds and give these kids a better future. That's why I put up with the abuse. Someday I want to be a permanent employee with my own class, but until then, I'll do my time in the trenches. Richard hesitated. I'm hoping to make detective. So we both have reasons for overreacting. Ross tried a smile. I'm sorry if I offended you. You're fine, Richard said, pocketing his wallet. This has been a difficult case for me. I wish it was just about the fires, I really do. They sat again, Ross wanting to learn about the person across from him. So, becoming a detective, what does that entail exactly? Experience, Richard said. I've only been a street cop for a few years, and without trying to sound arrogant, I'm good. I bring in the numbers without harassing people who don't deserve it. I'd like to think I have an above-average understanding of how the human mind works, and I've taught myself to notice the world around me. That might sound simple, but most people aren't aware of what surrounds them. Speaking of which, where did that come from? He pointed across the table. Ross followed his gaze, then laughed while rubbing his wrist. My tattoo? Yes, you either got it before meeting me for dinner, or you have some way of hiding it while at work. Makeup. Seriously? Yep. Ross looked down at the line of black ink that looped back on itself like a bow. I've had more than one job interview go wrong because of it, and the superintendent of my current school has a strict policy about tattoos and piercings. What does it signify? Richard asked. I know it's the symbol for infinity, but what made you choose that? It's personal. Richard laughed. Oh, I see. You can ask me questions, but when I try to do the same... Exactly. Back to you becoming a detective. What needs to happen? A certain amount of solved cases, catching someone on the most wanted list? That would help. Broadening my own mind wouldn't hurt either. I shouldn't have needed to come to you for help. Ross scrunched up his nose. You can't blame yourself for not speaking Spanish. I can, because it's a useful skill in my line of work. I could teach you. Richard cocked his head. Wouldn't that be difficult? I don't mean to sound arrogant, Ross said with a smile, but I'm pretty good at my job too. So, besides work, what keeps you occupied? A busy personal life? Richard snorted. No. Oh. You sound happy. Only because it sometimes feels like I'm the only single guy my age. If that's the kind of personal life you mean, then yeah, I'm single, but it's by choice. I do perfectly fine with the ladies. Right now I'm focusing on my career. Oh. Now you sound disappointed. Ross frowned. There's such a thing as being too observant, you know. He was right, though. Ross did feel disappointed. He didn't want to hear about Richard's luck with women. Just this once, he wished that he could meet someone who was intelligent, handsome, kind, and gay. Okay, maybe that was a tall order, but he had tried to keep himself in check this time. It was only because Richard had hinted earlier. Actually, Ross was no longer sure what that was about, and he intended to keep digging until he found out. So, when you're not chasing bad guys, what do you do for fun? I like movies. About chasing bad guys. I should have known. Richard smiled, and others too. Comedies, thrillers, musicals. Ross raised an eyebrow. Musicals, really? Richard's face turned red. What's wrong with that? Nothing, really. Ross was tired of beating around the bush. It's just that you're going out of your way to keep sexual orientation out of your investigation. That level of sympathy is unusual. Is it? Yes, but only for a straight man. You said earlier that you understand what it's like to be closeted, so I'm guessing you have a gay brother or sister, unless you yourself are gay. Richard stared at him evenly. You're very observant. Ross grinned. Maybe I'll make detective someday. You also leap to conclusions. Richard lowered his voice. I'm not gay, but I did have an experience once. An experience? He nodded. When I was younger. No one found out, but I can imagine what might have happened if they did. That's why I'm able to sympathize. Richard had been open with him, so it only seemed fair to do the same. Just so you know, Richard spoke before he could finish. I wouldn't be a good detective if I hadn't figured you out already. Am I that obvious? Richard shook his head. No. Ross sighed. Even if I was, I wish it didn't matter. Same here. Like I said before, I'll try to keep my partner focused on the arson. So what's next? Ross asked, keeping the question intentionally vague. Gay or not, he liked spending time with this man. Now that they were done eating, he wouldn't mind watching a movie together. Even what about chasing bad guys? Richard's mind was still on business, though. You need to find out what you can about both boys. Talk to... what was his name? Ben, Ross said, deciding to trust him at last. Ben Bentley. Richard nodded. Talk to him and see what sort of impression you get. Maybe get both guys in the same room together and see if there's a reaction. It could be that Tim doesn't like Ben because he's gay. Ross shook his head. I don't think so. If he had made a face or said something homophobic, that would have been more natural. The way he went so still felt like a practiced response. You speak from experience? Yes, Ross admitted. I do. Richard studied him and nodded. Definitely get them together, but make it look like an accident. What am I looking for exactly? Facts, Richard replied. That might sound simple, but believe me, people will do anything in their power to hide the truth. Our job is to find it again. As he stood and returned to the buffet for another serving, Ross tried to decide which interested him most, the amorous arsonists or the open-minded officer. Ross was in full detective mode, starting first thing in the morning. Ms. Hughes had said something the other day that struck him as odd. She had insisted he shouldn't contact the front office about Ben, and despite having had no intention of doing so, now he felt he should. Carefully. Most teachers didn't stroll into the office and demand to know dirt on a specific student. If a record of disciplinary action existed, normally he would have to go through the principal to get it. Lucky for him, the secretary was a hopeless gossip, and few things made her happier than someone asking a juicy question. "So," Ross said after making the prerequisite small talk with her, "I've got this kid in third period, Ben Bentley." "Ooh, him." Jessica leaned across the desk, her voice already a conspiring whisper. "You know he's light in the loafers, right?" "I don't think I've ever seen him ever wear loafers," Ross said, smiling to show he was only kidding. "Is he trouble? Anything I should be concerned about? You know how we substitutes get the worst side of students." "Just don't leave your classroom unlocked," Jessica said, widening her eyes meaningfully. "I don't follow. Did he steal something?" "No." She looked behind her to make sure the hallway to the principal's office was still empty. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet he could barely hear her. "Bentley trashed the journalism room. He knocked over furniture, tore up photos in the dark room, and then took a fire extinguisher to it all." A fire extinguisher? An ironic tool for an arsonist to use, but it did match the theme, sort of. Why? What was his reason? "No idea, but old Mrs. Jones nearly died of a heart attack." Jessica covered her mouth to hold back laughter. Ross felt like joining her. The idea of trashing Mrs. Jones's classroom had never occurred to him, but if anyone had it coming, she did. Still, this was serious. Thinking dark thoughts and acting on them were two different things. Ben had a history of vandalism. That, when combined with everything else, made him even more of a suspect. Ross was tempted to call Richard and declare the case closed. Rather than be accused of jumping to conclusions again, he decided to wait until third period. Ross would talk with Ben in person and see what sort of impression he got. And he would set a small trap. "Could you do me a favor?" he said to Jessica. "I need to get a message to one of my students, Tim Wyman. Could you ask him to meet me in my classroom during lunch break? He promised to help tutor another student of mine." Tim would be passing on information, all right, but Ross would be the one taking notes, watching as Ben and Tim came face to face, partners in crime, exposed at last. Ross was enjoying himself a little too much. He taught his third period class with dramatic flair, often cocking an eyebrow as if the secrets of his students were laid bare for him to see. He even toyed with them, introducing vocabulary words like vandalism and crime, looking to Ben each time for a reaction. All this revealed was just how little he paid attention. Any time that Ross checked on him, Ben was either staring down at his book or at one of the wall posters. In particular, the one that used a painter's palette to teach the Spanish words for colors, which for whatever reason caused him to sigh despondently, and in at least one instance, to glare. Strange kid. When the bell rang, Ross was prepared. "Okay, class, don't forget your assignment for tomorrow. Act out a scene with your partner, 5 lines of dialogue each. Be creative and have fun. Ben, if I could see you for a moment." The irritated expression remained. "Fine." Fine? Substitute teachers were used to a lack of respect, but so far he hadn't had trouble with Ben. Ross closed the classroom door, giving them privacy, and then turned. Ben stood in front of the desk, arms crossed over his chest. Rather than place himself behind it, Ross sat on the desk, angling himself to face Ben in what he hoped was a more personable approach. "I'm concerned about your grades." Ben shrugged. "I find it difficult to concentrate in this class." "Any particular reason?" "Yes." Ross waited for a more in-depth explanation, but it didn't come. Ben stood his ground, brow knotted in open aggression. Where was the good heart Ms. Hughes had praised? "Is there anything I can do to help?" he tried. "Is Senora Vega ever coming back?" The spiteful tone left no room for interpretation. "I see. You feel my teaching is the issue." "You're the problem," Ben said, clenching his jaw. Then he shook his head and kept his gaze down. "Never mind. Sorry. I'll try to get my grades up." "You'll have to work hard. The school year's almost over." Ross decided grades didn't matter right now. "If you don't mind me asking, what exactly did I do wrong?" Ben raised his head. He was a nice-looking kid with soft, dark blonde hair and brown eyes that normally didn't appear so furious. "You really want to know?" "Of course." "One of the first times you subbed, someone asked you how to say faggot in Spanish. You probably don't even remember. I do. Want to guess why? Because every day in this stupid school feels like a war, and I'm the only one on my side. Just try to picture that. Then imagine how crappy it feels when the enemy is given a new word, a new weapon, to use against you." "Mariposa," Ross said, understanding at last. "It doesn't mean what you—" "It means butterfly, I know." Ben clenched his jaw and turned his head away. He seemed to be holding back tears. "I'm sorry," Ross said. "I always get questions like that. Cuss words are the first thing anyone wants to learn in a new language. I decided a long time ago to always give an answer, but a harmless one. When people ask me how to say shit, I teach them how to say manure. If it's bitch they want to know, I teach them perra, a female dog. I choose harmless words so these students at least learn something, just not what they wanted. I didn't expect those words to be used to hurt anyone, including you." "Well, they did," Ben said, looking defiant again. "And right now, it's the last word I ever want to hear." "I'm terribly sorry," Ross said, feeling guilty. "And I understand where you're coming from." "Do you?" Ben challenged. In a different world, a liberal East or West Coast school, perhaps, Ross would have confided in him. "Don't worry, you're not alone. I'm gay too, and I know how bad slurs can hurt." But he was deep in the heart of conservative Texas, dealing with an angry teenager who already resented him. Giving him ammo could be dangerous. Or maybe it would help ease his anger. Ross hated feeling shackled just because of who he loved. Other teachers could mention their relationships, the families waiting for them at home, without fear of persecution. They would never have to choose between their job and the urge to comfort a student who was hurting emotionally. Then again, maybe helping one person was worth throwing away his dreams. Ross wasn't sure he could live with himself otherwise. "Listen." Knock, knock, knock. He took a deep breath and sighed at the interruption. "That'll be Tim Wyman." "What?" Ben's eyes went wide, proving they knew each other. In fact, he looked downright panicked, which was more of a reaction than Ross had expected. "Is that a problem?" "Yes," Ben whispered, all aggression gone from his voice. "I can't explain, but please just get rid of him." Ross studied him a moment. Ben's reaction wasn't the fear of being caught. Something else was going on. And when he realized what, he felt guilt right down to his core. "Okay, just a sec." He went to the door, opening it just a crack. Tim was standing there, concerned expression shifting effortlessly to one more charming. That smile was like a deadly weapon. Even Ross found himself struggling to form a coherent sentence. He could imagine how a guy like Ben might fall for him, and how devastating the end of that relationship would be. "Spanish tutor reporting for duty," Tim said easily. "Great. I'm not actually ready for you today, so, Goodbye." He shut the door and pressed his back to it. No need, because few students, when told they didn't need to work, stuck around to argue. He noticed Ben's vulnerable expression. "I take it you two know each other?" Ben nodded once. "We used to." But not anymore. The jaw clenched, followed by steely resolve. "No. Not anymore." "I see." Ross gathered his thoughts, then walked back to the desk. "I really am sorry about my carelessness. For what it's worth, butterflies are magnificent creatures. As you know, they begin life as caterpillars, which, if you think about it, do a much better job of blending into their surroundings. They're green, with just enough stripes to mimic a pattern of shadow, and despite this natural ability to hide, they still listen to the urge to climb high and put themselves in a vulnerable state. When a caterpillar emerges from its cocoon, it's more colorful and delicate than before. They only end up drawing more attention to themselves, but butterflies are the lucky ones. They're destined for more than just crawling around and chewing on leaves. They're meant to fly." Ben swallowed and took a deep breath. His eyes were watery, and he looked as though he had much to explain, but in the end he merely shook his head and said, "I'll try to improve my grades." Ross shoved aside his disappointment and tried to find some way to help. "I can give you an extra credit assignment. That should be enough to earn a passing grade." Ben nodded, his fingers clutching the straps of his backpack. "Can I go?" "Of course." Ben went to the door and hesitated, perhaps worrying that Tim hadn't gotten far enough away yet. "It won't always be like this," Ross said. Ben spun around. "What do you mean?" "That most of us are smart enough to outgrow the high school mentality. College is a different place, and if history is anything to go by, someday attitudes will change in the adult world as well. You'll soon leave these struggles behind, name-calling and foolish teachers who are careless with the knowledge they impart. You'll rise above it all. Just you wait and see. In the meantime, I admire your bravery. You're an inspiration." Ben considered him. Then he nodded. "Thanks." If he was still worried about running into Tim, Ben didn't show it as he opened the door and slipped into the hallway to continue fighting his war. The teacher's lounge was mercifully empty. Ross only returned there to fetch the sandwich he had prepared, intending to eat it in his car to avoid bigoted teachers. Instead, he found Ms. Hughes sitting alone at the long table, quietly turning the pages of a tattered paperback. He nodded in greeting when she looked up and decided to join her. She set aside the book, waiting until he had swallowed his first bite before asking a question. "Solve any more crimes lately?" "Not really," he replied. "How did the last case go? I never heard the conclusion." "I'd rather not talk about it," he said, taking another bite so he couldn't speak. As he chewed and swallowed, he realized there were other issues that troubled him. "Do you think it's important to be a good role model?" "To our students?" Ms. Hughes chuckled. "While I'd like to believe they look up to us and base their behavior on our own, the truth is we barely register. We're just tiresome old people who get in the way of their social lives." "I didn't expect you to be so cynical." "I'm not. That's exactly how it should be. I want my students to form their own opinions. If the current generation always followed the lead of the previous, progress wouldn't be made. Oh, sure, I wish they admired all my accumulated wisdom and came to me for advice, but that's not how it works. Instead, I try to enjoy those rare occasions when I can actually make a difference. And yes, that's when I try to be a good role model." "Madam," Ross wagged a finger at her, "you should be principal." Or superintendent. Maybe even president. Ms. Hughes laughed. That'll be the day. No, I'm happy here on the front line where I feel like I can accomplish more. How? Ross asked, setting down his sandwich. Aside from trying to cram their heads full of knowledge, what other options do we have? Ms. Hughes took a deep breath. We can do what's best for them, even though it's not always what's right. I don't follow. We're supposed to enforce rules, and generally there are very good reasons for those rules, but not in every situation, and not for every student. You make exceptions? Ms. Hughes shook her head. I make judgment calls, even when they put me at risk. Like I said, it's so rare that we can actually make a difference. When the opportunity presents itself, I grab hold. Ross mulled over her words, picking up his sandwich for another bite of turkey and mustard. After taking a swig of cola, he reached a decision. The previous case you asked about, the one involving Ben? Everyone is going to be okay. I'll make sure of it. Ms. Hughes smiled. I'm very glad to hear that. Carpet vacuumed, toilet scrubbed, and kitchen counters wiped. Even hors d'oeuvres had been prepared, if Ritz crackers topped by slices of cheese and ham could even be called that. Still, it was safer than attempting to cook a real meal. A full belly also meant it was harder to get a buzz, and he needed Richard Adler to be a little drunk tonight. That would, in theory, make him more agreeable to suggestion. Ross tried to ignore the nervousness building in his stomach as he walked the apartment, performing one final inspection. He was considering pouring himself a drink to get a head start when he heard a knock on the door. He hurried to the living room and opened it, finding a police officer there in full uniform. Richard looked him up and down. Then his eyes moved to the scented candle burning on the coffee table and the small plate of crackers next to it. You wanted to see me? Are you on duty? Ross asked, failing to hide his concern. I just finished my shift. You said you had important information for me that apparently couldn't be shared over the phone. Again. I do have a flair for the dramatic. Ross stepped aside. Come in. He waited until Richard had passed him before checking out the slope of his shoulders and the curve of his butt. Ross loved the uniform a little too much. Please, sit down. Would you like a drink? He moved to the kitchen instead of waiting for an answer, hurriedly pouring 2 glasses of white wine. When he returned, Richard was standing next to the fish tank and tapping on the glass. Don't do that, please, Ross said, moving to join him. I don't think they like it. Normally I wouldn't. When's the last time you checked on them? When I got home, Ross answered defensively. He had made sure the tank was clean when preparing for the evening. He looked at the aquarium to see what he had missed, and his heart sank. There, on the water's surface, a sideways fish no longer moved. Are you kidding me? Ross moaned. Oh. Richard cleared his throat. I'm sorry. You must have been very attached to it. Not really, Ross said, but his heart still felt heavy. I don't even know if that's Marie or Pierre. They're French? They're scientists, Ross said with a sigh. At least their real-life counterparts were. The Curies were pioneers, especially her, in the field of radiology. Richard bent over to peer through the aquarium. I think you've got a widow on your hands because this one is Marie. How can you tell? Something about the eyelashes. Ross managed a laugh. Then he set aside the wine glasses and took out the small net he used to scoop out the aquarium. Do you mind if I take care of this? I don't want to leave her in there with a dead body. No problem, Richard said. Do you want to bury him or... Burial at sea, Ross said without humor. He scooped up Pierre, then walked to the bathroom toilet to dispose of the body, feeling terrible. He was reaching for the lever to flush when Richard placed a hand over his to stop him. "Say something first," he said. "What?" Ross replied, distracted by the minimal physical contact, which already felt electric. "Say something." Richard withdrew his hand. "He was your pet, right?" Ross nodded. "Okay, let's see. Pierre, you were a good little fish. I tried to make you happy, even though you probably would have liked a bigger tank. Or your freedom. I'll make sure Marie isn't lonely. She still got me, I promise. Just two old spinsters with no one but each other for company." He looked up sharply, wishing he hadn't spoken so openly, but Richard wasn't laughing. Instead, he nodded in approval. "Is it easier if I do it?" "No," Ross said. "I'd better. Like you said, he was my pet." The toilet flushed, the little black fish disappearing in a swirl of water. Richard patted him on the back. "Let's see about that drink." They returned to the living room and picked up their glasses. "To Pierre," Richard said. "To Pierre," Ross repeated, his heart filling with both sorrow and affection. He didn't know which feeling he wanted to focus on, so he settled on filling his stomach with wine instead. Richard did too, taking in the details of the room. "You live alone?" "Yep," Ross said, trying to sound upbeat. He didn't want to ruin the evening. He could sort out his feelings later. "Make yourself at home." He led by example, sitting on the couch and curling up his legs. When Richard sat on the opposite end of the couch, Ross angled his body toward him. "Is that a real gun?" "It's definitely not a theater prop. Does that make you uncomfortable?" "I don't know," Ross admitted, raising his glass again, mostly to keep his guest drinking. He hadn't been this desperate to get another guy drunk since sophomore year of high school when a cute new guy had joined the debate team. Nothing happened then except them both getting sick, but he had tried. His motivation tonight was nobler. "So, tell me about your day." "There's not much to report. Wrote some tickets for the usual things. Had a domestic violence call from a man who locked himself in his car because his wife caught him cheating. She was taking a golf club to the windshield when we got there." "Serves him right," Ross said. "What else?" "An emergency call that turned out to be a prank from two kids skipping school. Not the smartest move." Speaking of misbehaving students. "Have a cracker," Ross said, reaching for the plate and holding it out. "Thanks." Richard took one but didn't eat. "Listen, is this a social call or a—" "Just a prank. Ha I thought it would be nice to talk. That's all." "And I thought you had information." "I do, but it can wait. What do you think of the wine?" Richard took another gulp, nodding appreciatively. "It's nice." Ross did the same, the first hint of warmth spreading through him. "Can I ask you a question? What did you mean the other night when you said you had an experience?" "That's very personal," Richard replied. Ross shrugged. "I don't mind getting personal." "Fine. A story for a story. Tell me about your tattoo." Ross took another sip and set the glass on the table. Then he moved closer so a cushion no longer separated them. He held out his arm, wrist up. "Look closely." Richard set aside both drink and cracker, then bent over to peer at the tattoo. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" "Notice the scar?" Richard gently took his wrist and held it closer to his face. "I think so. Wait, is this?" "I was 15 years old," Ross explained. "I had figured out that I'm gay, which honestly felt like one more problem added to the pile. I didn't have the best relationship with my dad, I was getting picked on at school, and I was pretty sure God hated me. Teenage Ross was a mess. Solving my problems seemed impossible, so I decided to escape them." Richard's head shot up, expression sympathetic. "I'm sorry." "It's fine. After I made the first cut and blood poured out, I quickly realized that I didn't want to die. First of all, the cut hurt like hell, so I wasn't about to do the same thing to the other wrist. Secondly, if all those jerks in my life hated me, the last thing I wanted was to let them win. I went from sad to angry in the blink of an eye. Or the cut of a blade, I suppose. I put a shirt over the cut and had my mom drive me to the emergency room. She was so upset that we nearly ended up dying in a car wreck instead. That would have been ironic, huh? Richard's brow furrowed, the hand holding his wrist tightening. How can you joke about this? Because, as crazy as it sounds, my suicide attempt was empowering. For me, it was a turning point. Yeah, it was one of the darkest moments of my life, but it was also when I finally decided to fight back. That's what the tattoo is about. Infinity. I'll never give up. I'll never turn my back on life again. I'll always keep trying, keep feeling, keep loving, all of it. While I'm still alive, I'm going to give it everything I've got. That's very brave, Richard said, tracing his thumb across the scar. I don't always live up to the promise, Ross said. He reached out and moved Richard's thumb along the line of black ink instead. I try my best, though. That's all any of us can do. He was enjoying the physical contact and didn't want it to end. Richard felt differently. He let go of Ross's wrist, reached for his drink, and drained the glass. Refill? Ross offered. Yeah, please. Ross stood and went to the kitchen, bringing the bottle back with him. He topped off his own glass and refilled Richard's before taking a seat on the far end of the couch again, not wanting to crowd his guest and make him uncomfortable. That's my story. Let's hear yours. Richard groaned. It's embarrassing. Ask me anything else. Ross shook his head. Embarrassing stories are my favorite kind. Come on. I poured my heart out to you. Tell me about this experience you had. Richard's eyes were shining as he took another swig for courage. Fine. I was in college and working toward my associate's degree. While at a Halloween party, I met this guy. Let's call him Tarzan, since that's how he was dressed that night. All he wore was what are they called? A loincloth. Keep in mind that his muscles were in plain view. I couldn't stop staring. You're attracted to guys? Richard shrugged. At the time, I was just envious. I wanted my body to look like his, so I struck up a conversation, trying to learn his routine or whatever. Soon the guy suggests we work out together. Awesome. The next week, I meet him at the gym, and it turned into a regular thing. We never really talked much, which bothered me because I like to talk. But Tarzan never gave me anything to work with. So one day, I'm standing there spotting him. He's doing bench presses, wearing nothing but a tiny pair of shorts. I'm bored out of my mind, and when that happens... What? Did you get a boner? Richard nodded. It just happened. I'm staring at all this pumped-up muscle, and before I know it, one of my own is getting pumped up as well. His head isn't far from my crotch, and the athletic shorts I'm wearing are totally tempting at this point. Ross laughed. What happened? Forget spotting. I ran for the bathroom. The humiliation was enough to get things under control. Even worse was having to face him again. I had to, though. He was my ride. I hit the showers first to get that awkwardness out of the way. Then I went and waited by the car. Tarzan finally shows up in the parking lot, and he's glaring at me, so I start apologizing. Then he grunts something about us going back to his place to watch a movie. No. Yes. Keep in mind, we had never done anything social. Besides that initial conversation at the party and a bunch of workout sessions, we were as good as strangers. I accepted his offer, thinking he was trying to prove he's cool about the situation. Were you hoping for more? Richard grinned. Maybe. We make it halfway through an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, the sci-fi one where he gets a tracking device pulled out of his nose, when Tarzan whips out a surprise of his own. Simple as that. He doesn't say a damn thing. He just waves it, like someone offering a dog a bone. And what did you do? Richard winked.
Rough, rough.
You went down on him?
Hell yeah. I might have been confused about what it all meant, but I knew what I wanted.
Ross let his eyes dart over the police uniform again. So you're gay?
No, I like women. Correction, I love women. I'm bisexual, with an emphasis on the sexual part when it comes to guys. I find them attractive, and I like the idea of messing around, but it's never been emotional.
Not even with Tarzan?
Nope. He was the only one, in fact. The same events played out a few times before our workout sessions stopped as suddenly as they began.
Closet case, Ross said dismissively.
Honestly, I think he was straight and too socially inept to get any. Maybe he finally found a girl who disliked talking as much as he did.
Tarzan never reciprocated?
Nope.
And you've never loved a guy before?
I haven't, but that doesn't mean I can't relate to your situation.
Richard was a lot more relaxed than when he first arrived, spreading himself out and sinking into the cushions.
The station where I work is full of testosterone. Nobody knows about me, but I still take a lot of flack because I don't have the same good old boy mentality. So I get why you don't want to attract attention to yourself and why you're so concerned about your students. Speaking of which, what did you learn?
Ross eyed the wine glasses on the coffee table, wishing they were emptier. This was it. I talked to Ben today. We were wrong, kind of. Ben and Tim are a couple, or were, but they're not the arsonists.
Why do you say that?
Because he didn't want it to be true. Instinct? Ben is a good kid, trust me. He's not the one you're looking for.
And Tim?
If he was a bad person, Ben wouldn't have dated him.
Except it sounds like they've broken up. Maybe that's the reason why. Ben got tired of Tim wanting to burn down everything. I looked him up, by the way.
Who?
Tim.
Ross sat upright. How?
We have yearbooks at the station. You'd be surprised how often they come in handy. It might have been dark that night, but I shined my light right into his eyes. They're distinct. I remember them. Tim is the guy I chased, I'm certain.
Okay, Ross said, but that doesn't mean he's the arsonist. He's only guilty of having sex in public. Considering the circumstances, you can't really blame them, right? Richard didn't respond right away. He reached for his glass and took another swig.
I'm sorry, he's the most likely suspect. I can't ignore that.
Yes, you can. Just let this one go. Who besides us will know?
My partner.
Richard sighed.
Listen, the first week I was on the job, I responded to a call about a shoplifter. I showed up at the store expecting to see a punky teenager. Instead, it's someone 10 years older than me. Some people steal for the thrill or because they feel entitled, but this woman obviously didn't have much. Even worse, she was stealing baby formula. Had it been alcohol instead or cigarettes? He shook his head. I didn't want to arrest her, but the store owner insisted on pressing charges. I offered to pay for the baby formula, but he was adamant. Even though I hated myself for it, I had to bring her in. Now I know that I did the right thing.
How can you say that?
Because I'm not a judge. My job is to know the law and to enforce it. This woman needed help, but that's what welfare programs are for. Or what about the baby? Doesn't it deserve to be fed? I had no idea what condition the baby was in because it wasn't with her. Maybe this person had a drug problem. If so, what sort of environment is that for a child? If I had been asked to investigate further, I would have, but you have to trust the system. I'm sure Child Protective Services got involved, and that the judge she went before was more concerned with finding a solution than a sentence.
You can't know that.
Right, because I can't know everything. Your job is no different. Normally, you focus on teaching, and when there are disciplinary problems, what then?
I send them to the principal.
And I send them to the court system. It doesn't matter how much we like or relate to a person. If they're breaking the rules, they face the consequences.
More so than normal in this circumstance, Ross argued. What if their parents kick them out of the house, or they get beat up at school because they can't help who they love? They could be killed. Richard sighed. I know. But what if I look away, like you're asking me to, and they end up burning down the school? What if people die because I chose to turn a blind eye? Ross couldn't argue with that. I'll talk to them tomorrow. I'll tell Tim especially that I know about the fires, and that if I hear about one more being set, I'll have no choice but to alert the authorities. Richard shook his head. You could be putting yourself in danger. That's my choice to make. Besides, I've got a big, strong police officer looking out for me. Richard managed a smile, but not much of one. I don't like this. Just give me one more day. Let me talk to them. We'll see how they react and take it from there, okay? Great. He picked up the bottle. More wine? Richard laughed. It's a good thing my judgment is impaired. Otherwise, I would never agree to such a stupid scheme. That was the plan, Ross said, filling their glasses. I want to hear from you right after you talk to them. Call me. I won't wait for another dinner or whatever. I thought you liked spending time with me. I do, Richard said, a little too much. It's not the wine that made me agree. No, not at all. I've got a strong tolerance. Oh. Ross couldn't say the same. He didn't indulge often. There were too many alcoholics in his family, so he tried to drink sparingly. Right now, his head was buzzing, enough that he didn't think twice about what he asked next. Can I see your gun? Absolutely not. Richard noticed the shameless grin that accompanied this question. Wait, you mean, yep? Still concerned it's fake? Only one way to prove otherwise. Richard set down his glass and leaned back, hand on his belt. You sure about this? Ross abandoned his glass too, crawling forward with a smile. Rough, he said. On some mornings, Ross wished for a doctor who made house calls. Not that he needed help guessing the diagnosis. Headache with a slight case of heartache. He was suffering both and didn't regret either. Sure, he had drunk too much wine last night and stayed up late into the night talking to Richard. And yes, his jaw was still sore from other activities because Richard was more challenging than he had expected. All of it had been blissful and anything but superficial. This attraction went beyond the uniform, or Richard's impressive sidearm. Ross admired his integrity and passion for justice, even though he didn't share his faith in the system. When it came to rules, Ross sided with Ms. Hughes. Doing what was best wasn't always the same as doing what was right. Not for the first time, he wished he and Richard had met without the complication of an unsolved crime. At least not one that involved his students. Speaking of which, Ross returned his attention to the ongoing presentation, remembering that he had his own job to do. Good morning for you, Ben said in seriously broken Spanish. How much is the meat expensive? Cheap, my friend, replied his partner, grinning at the class instead of looking at his conversation partner. The meal is so fresh. Here is a wallet, Ben said carefully, for meat. Thank you, nice customer. Good night. Ross resisted a groan. Very good. Please take a seat. When this failed to provoke a response, he switched to English. You can sit down now. Just once he would like to have a student who surpassed his expectations. He checked his list for the next pair of partners. Daniel Wigmore, he said, feeling more hopeful, and Julie Snyder. Ugh, what a combination. One was an overachiever and the other refused to participate. Still, he was interested to see how the conversation would go. They each had 5 lines to recite. Once they were both standing in front of the class, Daniel began. Hello, Park Ranger. Could you please tell me the name of this forest? No. It's very beautiful here. Yes. I think I'll go for a hike. Can you recommend a good destination?
No.
I see. Is that smoke I smell?
Yes.
We had better run before the entire forest burns down.
Maybe.
Thank you, Ross said with an exasperated sigh. Julie, I expected more from you. Daniel, that was unique. As skilled as his Spanish was, Daniel got a little too creative when implementing it. He was unlikely to have such a conversation with a real park ranger. Ben's attempt to buy some sort of meat or meal was a more practical application, even though he'd managed to bungle it. At least Daniel had been inspired to think outside the box, and not for the first time. Previously, he had responded to essay questions by writing about a dramatic plane crash, or once an orphanage that had burnt down. Except he had accidentally chosen the wrong word, and Ross blinked, seeing a pattern that he should have noticed sooner. Explosions and fires. If he didn't have a class staring at him, he would have torn through old assignments, seeking more evidence. Instead, he called another pair of names, only halfway paying attention as he sized Daniel up. He wasn't athletic, although the gangly arms and legs probably helped put distance between him and anyone in pursuit. His light frame could give him an edge on someone like Officer Adler, whose heavy muscles might slow him down. And hadn't Richard mentioned that the arsonist had gotten a head start? And yet, Tim had already been identified, thanks to his yearbook photo. So it was a moot point. He and Daniel didn't have similar eyes. It was unlikely to be a case of mistaken identity. Unless, what if Ben and Tim being in the park that night was a complete coincidence? For the rest of the period, Ross tried to decide on a course of action. He had planned on talking to Ben after class, but when the bell rang, he asked Daniel to stay behind instead. "You have a gift for this language," he said. "Thank you very much," Daniel replied, smiling eagerly in return. He was awkward. The red hair probably drew enough insults. Ross's brother had suffered the same treatment. But the way Daniel didn't know when to hold back, when to play it cool instead of boasting about his achievements, probably didn't help him make friends. It wasn't difficult to imagine him needing to exercise some of his frustration. "There seems to be a theme. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded. "Incendio," Ross said, mouth dry. "Do you know that word?" "Incendio?" Daniel replied. "No, sir, what's it mean?" "Arson." Ross watched carefully for a reaction, but he couldn't have missed it. Daniel's face lit up. Then he grinned as if he were delighted. "Incendio!" "Right," Ross said, trying to keep his own expression neutral. "You've chosen fire as a theme before. Try to broaden your scope. You're a smart young man. Choose something different next time." "I will, sir," Daniel replied. "Thank you." "Enjoy your lunch." As soon as Daniel was gone, Ross decided he would hurry to the teacher's lounge and, assuming he found privacy, call Richard to tell him what he had learned. Officer Adler would show up in full uniform, probably with his partner in tow, to arrest Daniel. Then he and Ross could finally put this entire mess to bed, leaving them free to pursue whatever potential they had. A relationship? A lifetime spent together? Who knew? Ross frowned. He liked the idea of being with Richard. What sat uneasy with him was the idea of ratting out any of his students, not just Ben and Tim. Sure, he felt slightly more protective of them due to his own sexuality, but Ross also knew how difficult being young could be, and how easy it was to make mistakes at their age without realizing the seriousness of the ramifications. "Just a moment, please." Daniel was on his way out the door, but he stopped and turned around. "Sir?" Ross walked over to meet him. "It's a funny coincidence, your chosen theme, because there have been a series of fires lately. Intentional fires. Arson." Daniel appeared genuinely concerned. Really?
Yes. I know the investigating police officer, and he says he's close to catching the perpetrator. In fact, the arsonist is someone at this school. Daniel swallowed.
Oh, that's terrible.
I agree. It'll all be over because the police have a trap in place. One more fire and they're convinced they'll catch who's setting them. Don't ask me how. Maybe they're following that person around. I don't know. My point is that you shouldn't joke about fires right now. That could have serious consequences. Daniel went pale.
I'm sorry.
It's fine, Ross said, giving him a friendly pat on the arm. You didn't mean any harm. I just don't want anyone getting the wrong idea about you. How are you doing in general? I remember how difficult high school was. Not the classes or grades. I did fine there. So do you. You're very gifted, Daniel. Other students don't always appreciate that, do they? Sometimes they hold it against you, am I right? Daniel nodded numbly. I've been there myself. Don't let it get you down. Your intelligence will make you successful. Everything life has to offer will be within your grasp as long as you make the right decisions. But for now, maybe let other people share the spotlight with you. School doesn't have to be a competition. Let your good grades speak for themselves, and if anyone gives you a hard time, come talk to me, okay?
Okay,
Daniel said.
Thank you, sir.
No problem. Ross watched him leave, feeling pleased with how the conversation had gone. The sensation was fleeting because he still had a very determined police officer to deal with, one who had given him until the end of the day to find his arsonist. Ross threw open the door before Richard could knock. He had been pacing back and forth, peering through the peephole at regular intervals, anxious about this encounter. Judging from the other man's expression, he was right to be. I'm here on business, Richard said. Or perhaps Officer Adler was more appropriate, because not only was he in uniform, he was using his slightly deeper professional voice. Only one thing seemed out of place. A plastic bag he held that was filled with water and 2 black fish.
Aww,
Ross said, reaching for it instinctively. Oh, Richard cleared his throat. Right. First this, then business. Sounds like a plan, Ross said with a smile. Come in. I hope you don't mind. I know you're probably still missing Pierre, but I did some research on Marie Curie. She had 2 daughters. Did you know that?
No,
Ross admitted. Or if I did, I must have forgotten. She did, Richard said, walking with him toward the fish tank. I didn't want Marie to be alone, so this is Irene and Eve.
Yay,
Ross enthused, taking the bag from him. You even got the right kind. These are black skirt tetras. Richard puffed up his chest in pride. Like I said, I try to be observant. The guy at the pet store said you're supposed to let the water temperature adjust gradually. Ross nodded, already lowering the bag into the aquarium. You're so sweet. What a great idea, too. I really think Marie has been depressed lately. You were supposed to call me during the day. Ross turned to face him, surprised by the sudden change of topic. I got sidetracked, but I have good news. You want another drink or more of my famous Ritz crackers? Richard shook his head. I told you yesterday that I didn't want another dinner date. I want the truth. Do you regret what happened? Richard exhaled. No, I don't. He put his hands on his hips. Tell me what's going on. No small talk, no drinks. None of the other stuff either. Please. Ross nodded. Okay, I found the arsonist and it's not Ben or Tim. I happened to notice that one of my students is preoccupied with fire. I had a talk with him after class and, well, there's little room for doubt. It's him. That's great. Richard unbuttoned a shirt pocket and took out a small pad of paper. What's his name? About that. Not this again. Are you serious? He's let me guess, a good kid? Ross nodded enthusiastically. Yes, he's very intelligent, maybe a little socially awkward, but he's got potential. Richard glowered. That doesn't matter. Sorry? I have a job to do. You're obstructing justice.
Ross laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Are you going to arrest me?"
"I'm damn near tempted,"
Richard roared. He walked deeper into the living room, pinching the bridge of his nose.
"This needs to stop. I like you. I really do. What I said the other day about my attraction to guys being only sexual, I'm not so sure anymore. Do you know what my favorite part of last night was?"
Ross grinned, remembering what they had called it. "Friendly fire?"
"Nope. It was talking to you before we got down to business. Afterwards, too. Don't get me wrong. I enjoyed all the stuff in between, but it's you I like. Your personality, your thoughts, all of you."
"Wow," Ross said, at a loss for words. "Thanks."
"This case," Richard said, holding up a finger and continuing to pace, "is in our way. We need to put it behind us so we can freely explore our potential. Assuming you even want that."
"I like you too," Ross said, taking a step closer. "Mind if I show you how much?"
Richard's expression remained grim. "Not now. Just tell me the name of the arsonist. Please."
Ross sighed. "I already talked to him about it. I told him the police were closing in and that all it would take is one more fire to catch the culprit. He's done. You have my word."
"That's not enough."
"Why not?" Ross said indignantly.
"Because you can't control what this person will and won't do. That's not a promise you can keep. Only he can."
"Okay, then how about this? If there's another fire, just one, then I'll tell you his name." Richard stopped moving. Head hung low as he shook it.
"This is like Tommy Wilson all over again."
"Tommy who?"
"When my sister was 14, she started dating this guy from another school. Tommy lived in the next county over, far enough away that it was too long to walk or bike, so she started taking our parents' car."
"She knew how to drive already?"
"Not officially, but she still managed to get to Tommy's place and back. I was scared for her. My sister kept reassuring me that everything would be fine. This went on for weeks. I wanted to tell my parents, but she begged me not to."
Richard paused, eyes unfocused as he stared into the past.
I remained silent, just like she wanted. One night, she and Tommy were out for a joyride. They thought it would be fun, the idiots. That's when she ran a red light and the car was sideswiped.
"Oh my God, was she—"
My sister was fine, but Tommy suffered brain trauma. I had met him a few times before. He was always nice and even brought me a bunch of his old comics when he found out I liked them. The accident left him unable to speak. He recovered eventually, but he still doesn't sound normal. And frankly, I don't think it's just his words that are jumbled. So basically, because I held my tongue like my sister asked me to, someone ended up with brain damage. A good kid, too. Tommy also had potential."
"You can't blame yourself for that."
Richard scowled. "I can, and I do. Yes, it was my sister's fault, and his, but I also had a choice. I had the power to prevent what happened. I didn't, and that's exactly the sort of situation you're putting me in now."
"Okay," Ross nodded. "I can understand where you're coming from, but I need to tell you a story, too. Or at least continue one. Remember my suicide attempt? I talked about all the abuse I had gone through, but do you know what pushed me over the edge? I failed physical education. I had a coach who was really mean, and he told me if I didn't do enough push-ups, the details don't matter. Failing PE doesn't matter. What a joke. But back then, it felt like the end of the world to me. I knew I would get teased even more, and my parents would be angry, so I decided to call it quits. Small things seem like a really big deal when you're that age, especially if you're already dealing with being bullied. So it's not just that I like these students, I'm trying to prevent them from getting hurt or wanting to hurt themselves." Richard crossed his arms over his chest.
"So, you never give them failing grades, even if they deserve it?"
"I give them another chance. extra credit or makeup tests. And yeah, I do have students like Julie Snyder who still don't give a crap and fail. But not before I try my hardest to help them help themselves. Ross rolled his eyes. That sounds cheesy. Forget I said anything.
It's not cheesy, Richard murmured. I like that about you, but in this one circumstance, I need you to let me do my job. I told my superiors I had a strong lead. They're expecting results.
Ross steeled himself. I won't give you his name. If you really do like me, then I'm asking you for this one favor. I realize we don't know each other very well yet, but I think we could go far. It's not hard to imagine us falling in love and being together for years, if not decades. I truly believe that could happen. Do you? Richard's reply was hoarse.
Yeah.
Then do this for that guy. The Ross in the future who you love more than anything, and I promise when we finally reach that day, I won't have asked you for anything else. Hell, I'll never ask you for another favor again. I just need one from you. In advance.
That's very romantic, Richard said, but it's also manipulative. If I do this for you, then that's it between us. We're finished. I won't date someone who uses my own feelings against me.
That's not what I'm trying to do.
Decide, Richard said. It's either him or me.
Ross was surprised to find it wasn't an easy choice. He had only known this man for a few days, but he really did believe in their potential together. He could see their future as if it were already written, a little two-bedroom apartment that they would share, maybe even a dog. Richard would be gallant and insist they adopt it from a shelter. Wouldn't that be cute? Then again, Ross had his own sense of nobility. He wouldn't betray one of his students, not when he was convinced that the threat was over. I need to think of my students' needs before my own. I'm sorry.
So am I, Richard said,
heading for the door. He turned around after opening it.
I wish we'd had more time together.
So do I, Ross said softly. Richard clenched his jaw, then strode toward him, closing the distance. He took Ross's head in his hands and kissed him like they would never have another chance. Only when Richard broke away and left the apartment, not turning around on his way out, did Ross realize that's exactly what it had been. Their last kiss. Their final goodbye. Love sucks, if that's even what it had been. Ross spent the next week feeling deflated. Life had been so exciting, if only briefly. A crime to solve and a passionate affair with a police officer. What could be better, and what did he have to look forward to now? Summer school, where the students were even less enthusiastic? He considered his current class, most of them with their heads lowered in concentration as they took a test. This wasn't a practice run. Only Julie Snyder, still protesting until the very end, wasn't trying. And Ben Bentley, who was in a daze, his expression despondent. Ross was pretty sure it matched his own. Lovesick. Their eyes met briefly before Ben panicked and resumed working on his test. However long he and Tim had been together, Ross hoped it had been more than a few lousy days. He found himself wishing Daniel would start another fire, freeing Ross from any obligation. So far, for better or worse, Daniel seemed to be taking their talk to heart. He even seemed more confident, not just when it came to schoolwork, but also when interacting with other students. That was good. At least Ross's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. He whiled away the rest of the period by staring at the calendar and calculating how long it would take for Richard to forgive him. Would 3 months suffice? 6? A year? Richard would probably be in a relationship by then. Ross felt confident about his own status. Hopelessly alone, as usual. When the bell rang and the classroom emptied, he collected the tests, put them in a drawer, and turned to face the door, hoping to find it occupied by a gruff police officer. It wasn't. Then he went to the teacher's lounge. Ross was eager for anyone to be there, even Coach Reynolds, because listening to him spew hate was better than facing the silence of his apartment. The lounge wasn't empty, but Ross didn't recognize the teachers there. Only the principal, Mrs. Newman, who was pouring herself a cup of coffee. She smiled when noticing Ross. "Senor Langdon," she declared, "I've got good news for you." "I could use it," Ross replied. "Senora Vega is back on her feet again. She'll be returning to teach the summer courses we talked about." In other words, Ross would soon be out of work again. "That's great," he managed. "Isn't it?" Mrs. Newman continued to smile. "You should take a nice trip somewhere. Do some traveling, maybe to Mexico. I imagine that would help keep your language skills sharp." His finances were in such poor condition that a trip anywhere was out of the question. No, he could look forward to another summer of waiting tables, unless he could find a new assignment. "This is a nice school," he said, already feeling pathetic. "I'll miss it. Keep me in mind if a full-time position opens up." "Will do," Mrs. Newman said, already turning away to speak with one of the full-fledged teachers. The sun might be shining outside, but the rest of Ross's day was gloomy and gray. What he wanted more than anything was a sympathetic shoulder to rest his head on. He would do just about anything for another cozy night at home with a certain someone. Instead, the apartment would be empty like his future now seemed. When all you have is nothing, at least you've got nothing to lose. Ross's uncle had told him that. At the time, he'd been too young to grasp the double meaning, or how it related to his uncle's gambling problem. Now it made perfect sense. Ross had nothing to lose at this point, which was oddly liberating. He could do absolutely anything, and matters couldn't get much worse. Even if they did, at least his life would be more interesting. He thought of a number of plans, some too crazy for him, but one wasn't so bad. At the very least, it gave him an excuse to see Richard again. Ross spent his free period writing a letter. After school, he went directly to the police station. "I'd like to speak with Officer Adler," he told the receptionist. "Just a moment," the man said, consulting his computer. Then he lifted his phone and had a clipped conversation before hanging up. "Officer Adler is still out on patrol, but a different officer would be happy to assist you. What's this about exactly?" Ross shook his head. "Adler is the only one I'll talk to. Will he be back soon?" "Is an hour soon?" "Sure, I'll wait." The receptionist made a face, but Ross ignored this and sat in the waiting area. The chairs were painfully uncomfortable, and many of the people he saw gave him the creeps, but he was determined not to give up. More than an hour passed, Ross fighting against boredom and despair, when a familiar voice finally pulled him free. "Mr. Langdon, how may I help you?" Richard's expression was all business. Only the barely withheld emotion in his eyes suggested that feelings remained between them. Ross shot to his feet. "Is there somewhere private we can talk?" A subtle shake of the head, then a repeated question. "How may I help you?" Ross swallowed and held out the letter he'd written. "This is a signed confession," he whispered. "I'm the arsonist." Richard clenched his jaw. "No, you're not." "This says I am." "Why?" Ross looked around to make sure they weren't overheard. "So the case can be closed, and your superiors won't be angry. I want you to make detective." Richard stared hard at him. Then he snatched away the letter. "Fine," he said, gesturing to a glass door where officers were coming and going. "Right this way." Ross walked to the door with unwavering resolve and waited there. Richard followed, using a special pass to gain entry. He held the door open, eyebrows raised expectantly. Goodbye, freedom. Ross walked forward on stiff legs, questioning his own actions. A long hallway led past more doors, voices and typical office noises drifting out from each. "Hold on a second," Richard said. "What?"
Ross responded, the hope in his voice transparent. Turn around. I need to cuff you. Oh. He had thought of this happening before, but in a warm bedroom instead of a cold concrete hallway. The handcuffs closed painfully tight around his wrists. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder to guide him. This way. He was led to a room as bleak as the hallway. Just 4 white walls, a small table, and 2 chairs. Richard shut the door behind them, the click echoing with finality. This was it. He was under arrest. You have the right to remain silent, Richard said, standing in front of him. You also have the right to explain why you thought a stupid ruse like this would work. He stepped forward menacingly. Anything you say may be used against you in a court of law. Ross stumbled backward, hands bumping against the wall. I'm doing this for you. You have the right to an attorney, Richard continued. Although a psychologist might be more appropriate. I'm thinking of starting therapy too. Maybe then I could finally get you out of my head. Wait, what? Richard grabbed him by the shoulders and brought their mouths together. A hand on the back of his head stopped it from hitting the hard wall as lips pressed against his hungrily. Ross eagerly reciprocated, almost crying out in protest when Richard pulled back enough to speak. Knowing and understanding your rights as I have explained them, are you willing to answer my questions without an attorney present? Yes, Ross breathed. Good. What's the name of the arsonist? Not this again. But you promised, and I need you to start trusting me. Otherwise, it's never going to work. Now then, what's the name of the arsonist? Daniel Wigmore, Ross answered. Good. Richard nodded. One more fire, and he's mine. That was the deal, right? His heart skipped a beat. Yes, it's the rest of the deal I'm starting to have second thoughts about. I figured. Turn around. Ross did as he was told, relieved when the handcuffs were unlocked and removed. As soon as his arms were free, he used them to hug Richard. I could use an extra chance, too, he murmured. I'll need to examine the evidence first. Richard unfolded the letter, laughing after reading a few lines. Could your plan be any more dramatic? Yes, actually. I was considering one where I would set a big fire and wait at the scene of the crime for you to arrest me. That would have been stupid. And another where I framed Julie Snyder for the crime, because if one of my students was going to take the fall, I'd rather it be her. You've moved on from obstructing justice to fraud. I'm so proud of you. I also toyed with the idea of figuring out where you patrol and speeding through the area every day, getting speeding ticket after speeding ticket, just so I could see you. I'm flattered. And a little frightened. You should probably stop while you're ahead. Okay. Ross looked into those dark, shining eyes and resisted a sigh. That future we talked about, do you think we can still get there? Richard nodded slowly. I think it's in the public's best interest if I keep an eye on you. You'll take me into custody? House arrest? That sort of thing? Yes. Although this time no more mixing business with pleasure. Then again, what? I talked to my head of department about learning Spanish. He thinks it would be a good idea, not just for me, but for the other officers as well. It would mean extra hours for you, which might not be easy to juggle with a day job, but I'm your man, Ross blurted out. Then he chuckled. In more than one way, I hope. Richard grabbed him around the waist for a kiss. My man. I like the sound of that. Ross sighed wistfully. He took it all back. Love didn't suck. In fact, it was pretty damn excellent. The final day of school had arrived. Ross was reminded of how eager his younger self had been for the semester to end and summer to begin, if only to escape the bullies. How ironic that he had signed up for a lifetime of this. Although maybe not. Thanks to a certain police officer, his career path now had a few forks, and he was still uncertain how far down this one he would wander.
He was already working on a lesson plan, repurposing the one he had begun writing on that fateful day when Officer Adler had barged into his life. Ross looked up, almost expecting to see him there. All he saw were students who were talking freely. In English, sadly. Even though Ross had given them a free period to do whatever they liked, he still couldn't help wishing that some of them would take the initiative and speak the new language they had learned. He tuned in on the various conversations, happy when he heard some snippets of Spanish after all. Daniel Wigmore, of course, but he was interacting with students with whom he usually didn't. Sure, he was translating obscene sentences into Spanish for the others' amusement, but if it helped him fit in and made next year easier, then so be it. Ross pretended not to notice and resumed working on his lesson until the bell rang. "Have a nice summer," he called, but he was already forgotten as his students fled the room, craving their freedom. All but one, that is. "Senor Langdon," Ben said, approaching his desk. "Do you have a minute?" Ross closed his lesson book. "Sure." "I just wanted to say thank you. Or apologize. Both, really." Ben shook his head and started over. "I know I haven't been a very good student, especially lately. It's not your fault. I guess I have negative associations with Spanish now, and that's made it hard to stay motivated." He thought of Tim Wyman's fluency in the language. It wasn't difficult to imagine how that could be used romantically, and how much those memories would hurt when their relationship came to an end. "You did fine," Ross said generously. "Foreign languages aren't for everyone, although sometimes it's just a matter of finding one that resonates with you. French, maybe. Or perhaps Italian?" Ben shrugged. "I think I'll stick to English. I still can't believe I passed." Technically, he hadn't, but Ross had snuck a few extra points on Ben's final test, just to make sure he would. "You earned that D-," he said in upbeat tones, trying to be encouraging. When he realized how ridiculous this sounded, he laughed. Ben did too. "I'll take what I can get. I also wanted to say that I'm sorry if I was rude to you or anything. It's been a rough year. Actually, it was really great up until the end." The year still had many months left, but he didn't think that was the end Ben was referring to. "I'm sorry to hear that. Are you looking forward to the summer break at least?" Ben took a deep breath and exhaled. "This is going to sound really dramatic, but have you ever felt like you had nothing to look forward to?" "Yes," Ross said instantly. "Very recently, in fact. I kept trudging along, and eventually, I discovered that life had some welcome surprises in store for me. I didn't sit around feeling sorry for myself, though. That's important. If you're not happy with your life, do whatever it takes to change it. As long as you aren't hurting yourself or others, don't hold back. We create our own happy endings." Ben considered this. Then he grinned. "You're pretty cool, you know that? Not many teachers care like you do. About our grades, sure, but not the rest of it. They don't care how we feel or what we're going through." "Some do," Ross said. "Don't give up hope there either." "I'm tempted to take your class again, but I guess that wouldn't be doing either of us a favor." "No," Ross said with a chuckle. "Probably not. But I wouldn't mind, although I don't think I'll be here next year. Senora Vega will have returned by then." "Oh," Ben frowned. "That sucks." "Between you and me, I think so too." "Well, wherever you end up," Ben said, "just know that I think you're awesome. And I bet a bunch of other people do too." Ross could only think of one he was sure about, because the morning had begun with Richard telling him and showing him just how appreciated he was. "Wherever you end up, I wish only the best for you, too. Just keep being true to yourself. Some people don't learn that lesson until late in their lives, if ever at all. You're ahead of the game, Ben. Keep it that way. Ben nodded. I'll try. See you around. Ross wasn't sure they would ever cross paths again, but he wouldn't forget the brave boy with a sad heart. In a way, he felt a certain kinship with him, although Ross hoped he had already found his own happily ever after in the form of a police officer with an unshakable sense of justice and a body that wouldn't quit. The thought made him laugh, and he kept on smiling as he imagined a relationship that would outlast the decades, surviving every obstacle and hardship to prove that love could be infinite.
Each Something Like book follows a different LGBTQ character on their quest for love. Central to the plot is the troubled relationship between Ben and Tim, former high school sweethearts who continue to meet over the years, their chemistry changing with each encounter. Surrounding them are a wealth of friends and enemies, each with their own story, resulting in an immersive universe filled with first times and second chances. While the series doesn't shy away from intimate details, it also focuses deeply on emotion, promising an experience that will stay with you long after the final page is turned. Available as an audiobook, ebook, or paperback at your favorite retailer.